We have come to that time of year when the stories we tell in church are familiar ones, maybe even favorite ones. The stories we tell, the stories we remember, they shape us. They provide identity. They bring calling. They are our light in the darkness. What stories are formative for you, that you remember, that you go back to again and again, that feel like home? Do you have that book you read almost every year? Do you have those stories you tell every year at Thanksgiving when the family's around, those stories of Christmas past? Do you have that fishing story of the one that got away, the story of that big buck you got one fall afternoon? What stories feel like home? Matthew had a story to tell. It was a story very familiar to his readers. They knew the Jesus story, but Matthew wanted them to not only know this story, but to understand it as well. Or better said, he wanted them to know this story so they could stand under it. For the life revealed in this story gives life to us. Matthew writes one of the most important books in the world, and he begins the account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, I don't know if you have a favorite Bible story, but if so, I imagine Matthew 1:1-17 is not it. In all my years, no one has ever claimed this as their favorite. To be such an important story, Matthew's opening is less than riveting. There have been better beginnings in Matthew's gospel, so we're going to play a game. I'll read a first line, and you tell me the book that comes from. You'll get Stephen points that are redeemable for nothing. So the first one is, call me Ishmael. Moby Dick, right, crisp, cryptic, claustrophobic. It's one of the most famous first lines, grabbing the reader's attention like a slap in the face. All right, what about this one? It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. I didn't even finish the line. It gets better. Yes, it is a tale of two cities. All right, no one at 8 o'clock got this one, so be better. Happy families are all alike. Yes, Anna Karenina, a name that always struck me as having too many syllables. All right, here's a good one. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a zombie in possession of brains must be in want of more brains. It's Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. It's classic. All right. When Mary Lennox was sent to Misselthwaite Manor to live with her uncle, everybody said she was the most disagreeable-looking child ever seen. Secret Garden. Here's an easy one. All children except one grow up. Peter Pan. All right, here's a tough one, one of my favorite books. I'll be impressed if anyone gets it. Everyone my age remembers where they were and what they were doing when they first heard about the contest. I feel like you know it. It's Ready Player One. Ready Player One. Now, my favorite first line is from Andy Weir's The Martian, but I can't read it in church. First sentences are doors to worlds, wrote Ursula Le Guin in her essay, The Fisherwoman's Daughter, which is to say, in the hands of our greatest writers, opening lines cast an immediate spell, grab your attention like a starter's gun, set the tone and even foreshadow what is to come. We might think Matthew could have benefited from a writer's workshop with Ursula Le Guin or Jane Austen or Charles Dickens. He begins, Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac was the father of Jacob, Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Makes really your heart just go a-flutter, doesn't it? But he can't stop. By the time he gets to Zerubbabel, the father of Abiud, and Abiud, the fellow of Eliakim, well, you would not be alone if you were skipping ahead to the part where the angels show up. The reason this strikes us this way is that we're not listening with ears that are 2,000 years old. The folks in Matthew's church would have been paying attention because they knew these names. They knew these names well enough to know the stories that go with each name. They knew them well enough to know when Matthew got a little playful with the list just to make his point. They recognized that this was not history. This is not Matthew's version of Ancestry.com. We think of genealogies as lists that tell us where we came from. We're curious about our family names, where we came from, if there's anyone really cool in our family lineage. I can count, in theory, William the Conqueror and the Plantagenet kings and queens and early settlers to Jamestown. It's interesting to trace your lineage. But that exercise is very different than from what Matthew has done. If Matthew was trying to be historically accurate, he did a bad job. He got a lot of it wrong. If I'm being honest, though, Ancestry.com is about the same way. But Matthew's interest is not historical. It's theological. The point that Matthew wishes to make is that Jesus came from God. Matthew does not tell us the history of Jesus. He tells us the story of God. So he tells of King David, the greatest of Israel's king. Everyone knew about David. Of course, you could see the resemblance in Jesus. And Jesus is the son of Abraham. He was the one who received the promise, your offspring will be as numerous as the stars. And he was the one who received the calling, be a blessing to every nation under the stars. And anyone paying attention could see this blessing showing up in Jesus. And Abraham was the father of Isaac, and we know about Isaac. He took that camping trip with his dad and almost became the sacrifice. Jesus would know about sacrifice. They knew these stories. They knew them well enough to notice when Matthew gets playful with the list. Rahab makes an appearance. Women were not common in ancient world genealogies. They thought only the men mattered. The women actually gave nothing to the children in the DNA or anything. They were just a carrying vessel. But Matthew seems to know something more. So Rahab's included. And what's more surprising is she was a woman. She was a Gentile. Maybe that's where Jesus gets his soft spot for Gentiles. It was quite noticeable. He seemed to love everyone. He also seemed to like people, women especially who were persistent, who fought for their families, who did whatever it took, like another Gentile woman who he proclaimed was a dog, but she wouldn't let that stop her from claiming her part of God's promise. Another woman in the genealogy is the wife of Uriah. We know her as Bathsheba. Just mention her name or the name of her murdered husband, you lift up the worst moment in the story of King David. Some might wish to tell the family story and leave out parts like this. This does not mention that whole thing. But Matthew knows that what we find in Jesus is strong enough to take the whole truth, dark side and all. All our families have shadow sides, stories we'd rather not tell, mistakes and shames. Jesus' family is no different. In fact, all families in the Bible are pretty messed up, if I'm honest. I find that strangely comforting. I'm in good company. Then Matthew gets even more playful. Matthew says that Abijah is the father of Asaph. But that's not right. Abijah's son was named Asa. Now, here's what's interesting. When you read it on your screen there, it said Asa. The NRSV translates it Asa. A lot of these later transcribers corrected the error and changed it for Matthew. But the earlier texts are clearly Asaph. Now, did Matthew make a mistake, or did he do that on purpose? Asaph was the collector of the Psalms. When you read the book of Psalms, you'll see Asaph's name throughout. Now, then Matthew says that Manasseh was the father of Amos. Now, of course, Manasseh's son was Amon. Everybody knows that. Not Amos. Amos was the prophet. Now, some say Matthew has just made some historical mistakes here, but I like to think Matthew is saying the story of God includes the soaring praise of the Psalms that Asaph collected and the biting truths of the prophets like Amos declared. And all of that is found in Jesus. It's all there. You see, Matthew is not telling a story of Jesus' history. He's telling the story of what God has done. And all of that holy story shows up in Jesus, who was born as the very Spirit of God with us. It's important to know this story because this story doesn't end with Jesus. The story goes on. The same Spirit witnessed in Jesus showed up in a long list of folks, reaching all the way back to Abraham, and continues today in ordinary folks like you and me. But that is determined by the stories we remember and the stories we tell, and how we understand those stories speak the truth. We've come to that time of year when the stories we tell in church are familiar ones. The stories that we tell and the stories that we remember, they shape us. Matthew writes this story in part because he knows all people need to remember where they came from. We have all come from God. That sounds so basic and so simple, but it's so often forgotten because we exclude one another and bully one another and torture one another and target one another and annihilate one another. Genocide is still a thing. Terror is still a thing. Assassinations are still a thing. And we do it to those who have come from God, who are a part of God's story. And whether we want it or not, whether we believe it or not, they're a part of our story. We live in the shadow and shelter of one another's stories. And sometimes the stories we tell and the stories we listen to cause us to hate those who come from God. Most of the violence that we see, political, religious, sectarian, have roots in some story, often a religious story. I cannot understand an expression of faith that causes me to destroy my neighbor. That's just not the Jesus story that I know, and yet it happens over and over and over again in history. All of this has happened before and will happen again. But I remember learning of a young Frenchman who spoke a different story. I like to remember that story. He was heartbroken because his wife was murdered in the Paris attacks in 2015, leaving him to raise their 17-month-old son. This is the story he wrote. On Friday night, you stole the life of an exceptional being, the love of my life, the mother of my son, but you won't have my hatred. I don't know who you are, and I don't want to know. If this God for which you killed indiscriminately made us in his own image, every bullet in the body of my wife will have been a wound in his heart. So no, I don't give you the gift of hating you. You are asking for it. But responding to hatred with anger would be giving in to the same ignorance that made you what you are. This is what I know. Every day, mostly in mundane ways, but on some days in the most dramatic fashion, we have to choose what stories we remember and what stories we will trust to light our path. Stories teach us, they shape us, they define us, they create worlds. And you choose what stories you listen to and what ones you go back to again and again, and what stories you tell, and what stories you share with your voice, or with the click of a retweet, or a forward, or a share. So it's a good thing we have come to that time of year when the stories are familiar. We need to remember them again and to seek to understand them well enough that we can stand under them and let them light our path. That's the way God's love might continue even in us. That's how light breaks in. Let us pray together. God of light and God of hope, thank you for the familiar stories, the stories of your love for us, the stories we celebrate in baptism, the stories that remind us that nothing we can do can separate us from your love. Lord, help us to stand under these stories, to share these stories, to live these stories that all might know that you are a God who is with us and for us. Amen.